Some US decisions shaped history. Others, they make you wonder if common sense just packed its bags and left. We're talking wars that never should have happened, laws that backfired so badly they belong in a comedy sketch, and enough wasted money to buy every American a private island, twice. And mixed in, some of the most ridiculous, shocking, and interesting facts about how the US has turned bad decisions into an art form. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and prepare to ask, wait, they really did what? 1. Prohibition. The US government thought banning alcohol would make society better. Instead, they created the mafia, turned ordinary citizens into criminals, and lost billions in tax revenue. After 13 years of gang violence and underground speakeasies, the government threw in the towel and said, okay, drink up. 2. The Vietnam War. Decades of intervention, 58,000 dead Americans, and a war that was doomed from the start. The US jumped in to stop communism, but didn't realize South Vietnam's government was corrupt and unpopular. The war ended exactly how experts predicted. Vietnam went communist, and America walked away humiliated. 3. Invading Iraq, 2003. Weapons of mass destruction. We have proof. Spoiler, they did not. The US toppled Saddam Hussein, but ended up destabilizing the entire Middle East, creating ISIS and spending trillions. And guess what? Iraq is still a mess. 4. The Challenger launch decision. NASA engineers warned that cold weather could cause a disaster, but managers, under pressure to launch, ignored them. The result? A national tragedy, with 7 astronauts lost. This wasn't bad luck. It was corporate negligence at its worst. 5. The 2008 financial crisis. The US let banks run wild, handing out bad loans like free samples at Costco. When the housing bubble popped, millions lost their homes, the economy tanked, and taxpayers had to bail out Wall Street. Lesson learned? Not really. 6. The Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA thought a small group of Cuban exiles could overthrow Fidel Castro. Spoiler, they couldn't. The mission failed in less than 72 hours, making the US look weak and pushing Cuba straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. 7. Japanese internment camps. During World War II, the US imprisoned over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, just because they looked like the enemy. No trials, no evidence, just fear. Decades later, the government admitted it was racist paranoia and apologized. Too little, too late. 8. Selling the Panama Canal. The US spent decades building the Panama Canal, controlling global trade routes, then decided to just hand it back to Panama in 1999. Now, China has massive influence there, while the US watches from the sidelines. Great job, guys. 9. The Great Depression policy failures. Stock market crash? Just let the economy fix itself. That was the government's genius idea in 1929. Unemployment hit 25%, banks collapsed, and millions lost everything. It took a decade and World War II to recover. 10. The decision to drop a second atomic bomb on Japan. Hiroshima was horrific, but Nagasaki? Many historians argue that Japan was already close to surrendering. Dropping the second bomb was unnecessary, horrifying, and forever changed global warfare. 11. Ignoring climate change for decades. Scientists warned about global warming back in the 70s. The US government? Meh, sounds like a future problem. Fast forward to wildfires, hurricanes, and rising sea levels. And now we're all paying the price. 12. The Afghanistan withdrawal. Disaster, 2021. 20 years, trillions spent, thousands of lives lost, only for the Taliban to take back control in days. The US government didn't plan the exit properly, leaving behind weapons, allies, and a country in chaos. 13. The decision to let telecom companies keep internet prices sky high. The US has some of the slowest and most expensive internet in the developed world because the government lets a handful of companies control everything. Meanwhile, South Korea and Europe have blazing fast internet for a fraction of the price. 14. The Flint water crisis. Michigan officials wanted to save money, So they switched Flint's water supply to a toxic river. Thousands of kids were poisoned with lead, and the government ignored it for years. No one went to jail. 15. The decision to overthrow Hawaii's monarchy. The US literally helped businessmen overthrow Queen Liliuokalani so they could control the sugar trade. Hawaiians never wanted this. A sovereign nation was stolen for corporate profits. 16. The decision to arm the Taliban. Back in the 1980s, the US thought, hey, let's fund Afghan rebels to fight the Soviets. Sounds smart, right? Well, those rebels later became the Taliban. Fast forward a few decades, and the US was now fighting the very people they once armed. Genius. 17. Letting the FBI spy on civil rights leaders. Instead of protecting Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists, the FBI spied on them, harassed them, and even tried to get MLK to kill himself. J. Edgar Hoover was more worried about black activists than the KKK. 18. The opioid crisis. In the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies pushed painkillers like candy, claiming they weren't addictive. Doctors overprescribed, people got hooked, and now hundreds of thousands have died from opioid overdoses. The best part? Big Pharma made billions and barely faced consequences. 19. The housing discrimination that created wealth gaps. For decades, black families were denied home loans and forced into poorer neighborhoods, while white families built generational wealth through real estate. The result? A racial wealth gap so massive that it still affects millions today. 20. The forced sterilization of thousands of Americans. For decades, the US sterilized poor, disabled, and minority women without their consent, claiming they were unfit to reproduce. The government literally decided who was allowed to have children. 21. The CIA's mind control experiments. During the Cold War, the CIA literally drugged people with LSD without their consent, trying to figure out how to control minds. The program was so insane and illegal that even the government eventually admitted, yeah, we probably went too far. 22. Turning prisons into a business. The US decided that private companies should run prisons. What happened? Mass incarceration skyrocketed, and prison owners made billions. More prisoners meant more profit, so they lobbied for harsher sentences. Justice? No, just business. 23. Selling guns without background checks. In many states, you can buy a gun faster than you can adopt a dog. No background check? No problem. What could possibly go wrong? Oh wait, everything. 24. The BP oil spill response. When millions of barrels of oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico, BP tried to fix it by dumping toxic chemicals into the water. The result? Even more environmental damage. Classic fix it by making it worse strategy. 25. The decision to build suburbs around cars, not people. The US built massive suburbs that require cars for everything, leaving cities unwalkable and public transport an afterthought. The result? Traffic nightmares, pollution, and a dependency on gas that still hurts the economy. 26. Trickle-down economics. The idea was simple. Give rich people tax cuts, and they'll invest in the economy, creating jobs for everyone. What actually happened? The rich just got richer, and wages stayed low. Who could have seen that coming? Oh, right. Everyone except the government. 27. The Dakota pipeline mess. The government approved an oil pipeline through sacred Native American land, ignored protests, and then, surprise, it started leaking. If only someone had warned them. Oh wait, they did. 28. Giving Facebook and tech companies too much power. Social media started as a way to connect people. Then the US let a few companies control the entire internet, spread misinformation, and sell user data. Now they can literally influence elections. Cool, nothing to worry about here. 29. The US government letting cocaine and heroin flood the streets. During the 1980s, the CIA allegedly looked the other way while drug cartels pumped crack cocaine into American cities, while at the same time starting the war on drugs that put thousands in jail. Hypocrisy at its finest. 30. Building entire cities in disaster zones. Florida, built on a hurricane highway. California, covered in wildfire fuel. The Midwest, tornado central. And every time disaster strikes, massive government bailouts instead of just, not building there. 31. The decision to overthrow Iran's government. In 1953, the U.S. helped overthrow Iran's democratically elected leader because he wanted to nationalize oil. Instead, they propped up a corrupt dictator. Fast forward to 1979, and Iran had a full-blown revolution, became anti-American, and has been a geopolitical nightmare ever since. Whoops. 32. Allowing airlines to deregulate themselves. Once upon a time, flying was comfortable, had real meals, and didn't feel like being packed into a can of sardines. Then the US deregulated airlines, and now we have hidden fees, constant delays, and legroom that only toddlers can enjoy. 33. The Supreme Court legalizing unlimited political bribery. In 2010, the Citizens United ruling let corporations spend unlimited money on elections. The result? Politicians now serve their donors, not the public. Democracy? More like a bidding war for the highest check. 34. The war on drugs. Instead of treating drug addiction as a health crisis, the US decided to throw millions of people in jail, disproportionately targeting Black and Latino communities. It didn't stop drug use. It created a mass incarceration crisis. 35. Letting insurance companies control healthcare. In most developed countries, getting sick doesn't mean financial ruin. But in the US, one trip to the ER can bankrupt you. Why? Because the government let insurance companies call the shots, making healthcare insanely expensive. 36. Not banning cigarettes sooner. By the 1950s, scientists knew smoking caused lung cancer. The tobacco industry spent decades paying off politicians and doctors to deny it. Millions died, and cigarettes are still legal today. 37. Building Las Vegas in the middle of a desert. What could go wrong with putting a major city in a place with no water? Well, now Lake Mead is drying up, and Vegas is one drought away from disaster. But hey, at least there's blackjack. 38. Giving Amazon and Walmart a monopoly on everything. The US let two companies eat small businesses alive. Now they control supply chains, pay workers pennies, and crush any competition. But sure, free 2-day shipping makes it all worth it, right? 39. The Massacre at Wounded Knee. In 1890, U.S. soldiers massacred over 250 Lakota Sioux, men, women, and children, then gave medals to the troops who carried out the slaughter. This wasn't just a bad decision, it was a war crime. 40. Turning college into a lifetime debt sentence. In most countries, higher education is affordable or free. In the U.S., student loans are a trillion-dollar industry, trapping millions in debt for decades. Congratulations, you got a diploma. Now enjoy your financial prison. 41. The government's response to Hurricane Katrina. A Category 5 hurricane was coming. The government's response? Hey, it'll be fine. Then New Orleans flooded, thousands died, and FEMA completely failed. 42. Selling American farmland to foreign investors. The U.S. has sold millions of acres of farmland to foreign countries. China now owns huge chunks of U.S. agricultural land, totally not concerning at all. 43. Turning the news into entertainment. Once upon a time, news was about facts. Then came 24-hour cable networks, turning news into a circus of outrage, misinformation, and talking heads screaming at each other. Ratings went up. Truth went out the window. 44. Ignoring infrastructure until bridges start collapsing. The U.S. has over 45,000 structurally deficient bridges. Every year, some of them literally fall apart. But instead of fixing roads, the government spends billions elsewhere and just hopes nothing collapses. 45. The decision to keep daylight savings time. Twice a year, millions of Americans lose sleep for no reason other than outdated farming schedules. Studies show it increases heart attacks, car accidents, and stress. But sure, let's keep pretending this makes sense. 46. Letting lobbyists write laws. In theory, Congress makes laws. In reality, corporate lobbyists literally write them. Pharmaceutical companies, oil giants, Wall Street, they hand over pre-written bills and politicians just rubber stamp them. Democracy? More like pay-to-play. 47. The decision to keep the penny. It costs more to make a penny than a penny is worth. No one uses them, vending machines don't take them, and yet the government refuses to get rid of them. Probably because Big Copper is pulling the strings. 48. Giving billionaires tax breaks while schools crumble. The US lets billionaires and corporations pay little to no taxes, while public schools literally hold bake sales to buy pencils. But don't worry, the ultra-rich will totally trickle some of that money down. Any day now. 49. Selling Alaska for pennies. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the US for just $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre. At the time, many Americans mocked it as Seward's folly, thinking the US wasted money on an icy wasteland. Fast forward, and Alaska is packed with oil, gold, and resources that made the US hundreds of billions. Russia definitely wants a do-over. 50. America. Land of the free, unless you had the wrong political views. In 1919, the US went full paranoia mode, arresting thousands just for being suspected communists. No trials, no proof, just straight to jail. Sounds familiar? 51. Cutting mental health funding and expecting no consequences. The US shut down psychiatric hospitals in the 80s, promising better community care. What actually happened? Tens of thousands of mentally ill people were left homeless or in prison. Genius. 52. The government letting train companies kill public transit. The US had electric streetcars and efficient trains in the early 1900s. Then car and oil companies lobbied to kill them, forcing Americans into car dependency. Now, traffic hell. 53. The decision to build skyscrapers without thinking about homelessness. The US has enough empty buildings to house every homeless person multiple times over, yet cities keep prioritizing luxury apartments over affordable housing. 54. Turning food into a chemical experiment. The US lets food companies add chemicals and dyes that are banned in most other countries. But hey, enjoy your glowing orange mac and cheese. 55. Not modernizing the power grid. Every winter or summer, millions lose power because the US grid is ancient. Instead of fixing it, we keep patching it together with duct tape and prayers. 56. Selling military equipment to local police. Why does your local police department have tanks and grenade launchers? Because the US lets the military sell them their old gear. But sure, a small-town sheriff definitely needs a SWAT team for speeding tickets. 57. Ignoring China's rise until it was too late. For decades, the US offshored manufacturing, let China dominate tech, and assumed they wouldn't challenge American power. Now, China owns supply chains, controls rare earth minerals, and builds the world's biggest navy. Oops. 58. Letting corporations own US water supplies. In several states, corporations own and control the water supply, meaning they can raise prices on something humans literally need to live. The US turned water into a business model. 59. Making student lunches worse to save money. The government cut school lunch funding, forcing schools to serve cheaper, low-quality food. The result? Mystery meat, cardboard pizza, and kids getting even unhealthier. 60. Turning Native American boarding schools into cultural erasure camps. The US forced Native American children into abusive boarding schools, where they were beaten for speaking their own language and stripped of their identity. It was cultural genocide. 61. Choosing Washington, D.C. as the capital. Let's put the nation's capital in a swamp, surrounded by brutal humidity, mosquitoes, and flooding. Great call, guys. Every summer, politicians basically melt while trying to run the country. But hey, at least the monuments look cool. 62. The Trail of Tears. The US government thought, hey, let's just force Native Americans off their land and march them thousands of miles away. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was ethnic cleansing disguised as policy. 63. The decision to fund Osama bin Laden. In the 1980s, the US armed and trained Afghan rebels to fight the Soviets. One of those rebels, Osama bin Laden. Great long-term planning. No. 64. The Dred Scott decision. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Basically, slavery was fine, and the Constitution didn't apply to black Americans. This directly fueled the Civil War. 65. The decision to annex the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. could have given the Philippines independence. Instead, they colonized it, sparked a brutal war, and killed over 200,000 Filipinos. Because, civilizing them was the priority. 66. Letting the Civil War become inevitable. Instead of actually addressing slavery, the U.S. spent decades making weak compromises that pleased no one. By the time war broke out, 600,000 Americans died over a conflict that could have been prevented years earlier. 67. The decision to put Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. The guy responsible for Native American genocide, dismantling the economy, and openly hating banks is the face of American money. The irony? He despised paper money. 68. The Alien and Sedition Acts. In 1788, President John Adams basically made it illegal to criticize the government. Newspapers were shut down, people were arrested, and free speech? Gone. Imagine Twitter existing back then. Half the country would be in jail. 69. Ignoring the Irish potato famine refugees. In the 1840s, millions of Irish people fled starvation and arrived in the U.S. and America's response? Discrimination, job restrictions, and treating them like dirt. The phrase, "no Irish need apply," wasn't just a joke, it was reality. 70. The decision to send troops into the Russian Civil War. After World War I, the U.S. sent thousands of soldiers to fight in Russia, for no clear reason. It accomplished nothing, left hundreds of Americans dead, and made relations with Russia worse for the next century. 71. The Reconstruction failures. After the Civil War, black Americans were promised rights and protections. Then the government basically abandoned them, let the South reintroduce racial oppression, and allowed Jim Crow laws to flourish. So much for justice. 72. Allowing child labor for decades. The U.S. didn't ban child labor until 1938. Before that, kids as young as 5 worked in factories, lost fingers in machines, and were paid next to nothing, and companies fought to keep it legal. 73. The Salem witch trials. A bunch of Puritans in the 1690s decided that teenage girls' accusations of witchcraft were totally legit, so they executed 20 people based on zero evidence. Fun fact, a judge later apologized and said, "Oops, we messed up." 74. Invading Canada. Americans tried to invade Canada multiple times and failed miserably every time. The most famous disaster was during the War of 1812, when U.S. troops thought Canadians would welcome them as liberators. Instead, Canada burned down the White House. 75. Letting the Dust Bowl happen. In the 1930s, farmers overworked the land so badly that it turned into a giant dust storm zone. Crops failed, families fled, and the government had to step in and fix what bad farming practices destroyed. 76. The decision to ignore Pearl Harbor warnings. U.S. intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications suggesting an attack was imminent. The response? Probably nothing. Then, December 7, 1941 happened. It's like watching a horror movie where the main character ignores every obvious warning. 77. The Zimmermann telegram screw-up. In 1917, Germany sent a secret telegram to Mexico, promising to help them reclaim Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if they attacked the U.S. Britain intercepted it and showed it to the U.S. Instead of ignoring it, Germany confirmed it was real. America immediately joined World War I. Talk about self-sabotage. 78. Letting credit scores control people's lives. The U.S. took the concept of trustworthiness and turned it into a number that dictates everything. Want to buy a house? Rent an apartment? Get a phone plan? Better hope your credit score isn't screwed up by an error that takes years to fix. 79. turning Alcatraz into a tourist attraction. Hey, remember that maximum security prison where some of the worst criminals in history were kept? Let's turn it into a fun sightseeing spot. Sure, because everyone loves a good selfie in a former torture cell. 80. The U.S. invasion of Grenada. In 1983, the U.S. invaded Grenada, a tiny island with a population smaller than most U.S. towns. The reason? They claimed the new government was a Soviet threat. The invasion was so badly planned that some American troops had the wrong maps. 81. The decision to let the stock market run wild in the 1920s. No regulations, no oversight, just rich people gambling with the economy. Then boom, Great Depression. And yet, every time Wall Street crashes, it's like nobody saw it coming. 82. The 18-year-long U.S. occupation of Haiti. In 1915, the U.S. invaded Haiti, claiming it was to restore order. Instead, they turned it into a military-controlled economy, forced Haitians into labor camps, and only left when protests made it politically inconvenient. 83. The Hawley-Smoot tariff disaster. During the Great Depression, Congress thought raising tariffs on foreign goods would boost the U.S. economy. Instead, other countries retaliated, trade collapsed, and the Depression got worse. Economic self-sabotage at its finest. 84. The Korean War stalemate. The U.S. fought 3 years of brutal war to stop North Korea from taking the South. The result? A ceasefire in 1953, and the border stayed the exact same. 2.5 million people died for no territorial change. 85. The Boston Tea Party backfire. Patriots dumped British tea into the harbor, thinking it would send a message. The British responded by locking down Boston and making life worse for everyone. The revolution happened anyway, but this move just made things harder. 86. Letting private companies own U.S. railroads. Instead of a nationalized rail system like Europe, the U.S. let private companies run railroads into the ground. Now, trains are slow, expensive, and outdated. And Americans wonder why Europeans laugh at Amtrak. 87. The decision to build New Orleans below sea level. Let's build a major city in a place that floods constantly. What could go wrong? Everything. Now, New Orleans relies on levees that fail when they're needed most. 88. Creating segregated highways that destroyed black neighborhoods. When the U.S. built highways, they purposely ran them through black communities, demolishing homes, businesses, and cultural hubs. Entire neighborhoods vanished, replaced by concrete and traffic. 89. The Bleeding Kansas disaster. Before the Civil War, Congress let Kansas vote on whether to allow slavery. The result? Pro- and anti-slavery forces literally started murdering each other. A preview of the Civil War that could have been avoided. 90. The U.S. decision to fund dictators during the Cold War. The U.S. armed, funded, and propped up brutal dictators just because they were anti-communist. Pinochet in Chile, the Shah of Iran, Mobutu in Congo. All brutal, all U.S.-backed. Some of them later turned against America. 91. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment. For 40 years, the U.S. government secretly let black men suffer from untreated syphilis just to study the effects. They lied, withheld treatment, and watched people die. Pure evil. 92. The Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. Imagine writing a document about freedom, and then including a rule that says, oh, by the way, if an enslaved person escapes, you have to return them. The Founding Fathers knew slavery was a moral disaster, but instead of ending it, they built it into the system. 93. The decision to let corporations patent life-saving drugs. Instead of making medicine affordable, the U.S. lets pharmaceutical companies patent drugs for decades, keeping prices insanely high. That's why life-saving insulin costs pennies to make but hundreds of dollars to buy. 94. The Monroe Doctrine. Great idea, terrible execution. The U.S. warned European powers not to mess with the Americas, but then proceeded to invade and interfere in Latin America constantly. Hypocrisy? Check. Long-term resentment? Also check. 95. Turning voting into an obstacle course. The US makes voting more difficult than it needs to be. Long lines, voter ID laws, gerrymandering. It's almost like some people don't actually want fair elections. 96. Selling guns to Iran while fighting Iran's allies. In the 1980s, the US secretly sold weapons to Iran, which they officially considered an enemy, and used the money to fund rebels in Nicaragua. When this got exposed, total scandal. 97. Letting the Pentagon lose trillions of dollars. The Department of Defense literally admitted they lost track of $2.3 trillion. No one knows where the money went. And the response? Meh. Imagine losing trillions and just moving on. 98. The decision to drop napalm on Vietnam. The US used napalm, an extremely flammable chemical weapon, on Vietnamese villages. The result? Burned civilians, horrific injuries, and images so disturbing they turned the American public against the war. 99. Sending troops to die for the Alamo. The Texas rebels at the Alamo chose to stay and fight against impossible odds instead of retreating. The result? They all died. Heroic? Sure. Avoidable? Also yes. 100. The US government secretly testing nuclear bombs on its own land. Between the 1940s and 1960s, the US set off hundreds of nuclear bombs in Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico, without telling the people living nearby how dangerous the radiation was. Thousands developed cancer, and the government took decades to admit responsibility. 101. War or business? In the US, it's both. Private contractors make billions supplying troops, charging $500 for a hammer and $10,000 for a toilet seat. The longer the war, the bigger the paycheck. Peace? That's just bad for business. And there you have it. Some of the worst, wildest, and most head-scratching decisions in US history. Some changed the world. Some just left a mess for future generations to clean up. And some? They're so ridiculous you have to wonder, was anyone thinking at all? But now it's your turn. What do you think was the dumbest decision on this list? Or did we miss one that's even worse? Drop it in the comments, and let's settle this debate once and for all.